do we still need face in Europe? Do we still need to be sort of part of this whole European project, or not really?
Well, I would argue yes. I mean, in Brussels, 80% of the rules that affect shooting and hunting at national level come from the European institutions.
So still, even after if we leave Europe on October the 31st, then we are still going to be kind of part of the European system.
Yeah, in fact, the UK will be much more vulnerable on its own than being outside of the European Union.
I thought we were supposed to be safer and making up our own minds about our futures. I read the side of a bus. It's amazing what it said.
I mean, there's a number of examples that I can go into, but maybe for the purpose of the audience, we are we're a European federation. Our members are national hunting associations in Europe's 35 countries. We deal with everything that affects shooting and conservation within the EU institutions, the other European institutions, and the international institutions.
Well, let's talk about general licenses, because I know that comes from Europe. I mean, I think, as everybody is aware, we shoot pigeons and crows and magpies in this country because of the general licenses. Is that the case across Europe? Does everybody have the same system as us?
So the general license system, it's the UK implementing the EU Birds Directive. The UK is interesting. With Ireland, you take quite a flexible approach in allowing the control of pest birds. And in fact, the whole issue you had here was really about whether the UK was interpreting the Birds Directive correctly. And really, it was on that point of no other satisfactory solution or not. It's interesting. Most other member states, they have a hunting season for wood pigeon, but they also control wood pigeon outside of the hunting season, but not in a way that's as general as the UK, and I would add Ireland as well. But still, it complies with the Birds Directive, and our position to the consultation here was that it does comply with the Birds Directive and the guidance of the Birds Directive by the European Commission. So it's important to maintain the general license system in the UK. Because
we need to be part of this kind of European general sort of spirit and direction of travel, or because there is a solid legal reason to do it?
Well, there is a solid legal reason, and I mean, post-Brexit, you still have the Berne Convention, and the UK is still party to that convention. And in effect, the text of that is identical to the Birds Directive, but certainly within FACE, we like examples of these more general approaches. And many other European countries look at the UK and they've tried to use the argument that the UK has a nice general system and we should apply that in our own countries. So that's useful. In many cases, it's a stricter approach in other European countries. In fact, to shoot crows and pigeons, you need to apply for a specific license in advance. But that's not needed, but that's the approach they take.
So has anybody in Europe not ratified the EC Birds Directive? Because it is 1978, isn't it? 1979. It's quite a long time ago.
Yeah. No, I mean, all countries, all EU member states have to transpose that directive, so they have to apply it. And just last week, the European Commission has taken France to court and Spain to court. They've opened infringement proceedings on the hunting of turtle dove, and in France for shooting grey-lag goose in spring under derogation. And the Commission also has legal infringements against Finland for common eider duck hunting in spring. It's just closed a case in Malta on finch trapping. It has another case against Spain on a type of finch trapping. All of these cases, they're under Article 9 of the Birds Directive, which is the same article that you apply the general license to here. So we're obviously very cautious when the Commission takes a member state to court, because the implications can be very broad.
Now, I said just before we leave the general licenses, I've got to give you one of my kind of complaints about it. We had a series of laws about which birds we can shoot and which birds we can't shoot that we had kind of come up with over a period of nearly 1,000 years, and they all pretty well amalgamated the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act. And that said, this is what you can't shoot, and that was fine. We were happy with that. And then we had the general licenses, which is a layer on top of that, which says, and you're not allowed to shoot anything at all. And then we had the derogations from the That was the EC Birds Directive. And then we had the derogation, which is called the general licenses, but you are allowed to shoot all these things. So we've got a kind of 3-layered cake now. Couldn't we do without the top 2 layers altogether and just go back to our old kind of 19th century laws?
You can't because of the Berne Convention. And as I said, UK is a party to that convention. It's the protection of biodiversity, flora and fauna. And if you read Article 9 of the Berne Convention, it's identical to Article 9 of the Birds Directive. So you have to make sure that you're preventing serious damage, that there's no other satisfactory solution, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't go back unless you leave another few conventions, which I don't think will be the case.
I think we've kind of lost the appetite for leaving stuff like that recently. Now, you do monitoring of European laws as part of your work. You also do lobbying. What are you lobbying on at the moment?
Well, our main work areas, we have migratory birds, large carnivores, not so relevant for the UK, but real big issues in Northern Europe, Southeast Europe. Firearms and ammunition, really, really hot issues. We had a European Firearms Directive revised. We're now dealing with implementation. I'll come to a few points on lead. There's a lot of other international agreements we follow. Hunting methods and culture, animal health and welfare. We have some big issues there. Generally in Europe, the trend is interesting. Ungulates, animals with hooves, are doing extremely well.
In terms of numbers?
In terms of numbers. Small game, pheasants, partridges, brown hare, they're going down. And this is all related to how farming has intensified.
Oh, you should visit Exmoor. It's amazing how many we got.
But it also leads to big problems. When you have big densities of ungulates like wild boar, we now have big problems with African swine fever. It's in 10 countries, well actually 11. We had an outbreak in Slovakia on Thursday. And all of these will major problems. They will bring numbers of wild boar right back down to historic lows, and they change everything with regards to hunting in these countries that developed their hunting cultures around wild boar, especially in the last 20, 30 years. We lobby on all of these issues. We work with the European Parliament, 750 elected members in Europe. The UK has elected 73 members of Parliament. These are important. We will be working with them. Now, after the 31st of October, it's going to be interesting. The likelihood of leaving, and other members will come in with other countries. We also work with the European Commission, and then there's the Council, which is the governments. So those 3 institutions really create the laws. We do a lot of work with the European Commission, and with the Parliament, we use our members. So these are the governments. We work with national hunting associations, and we advise them on how to advise their governments when these decisions are being made. So those 3 institutions are critically important. They set the laws, they set the policy, and we engage in all 3.
What are you advising on wild boar at the moment? Have you got a kind of consensus of opinion from all your different national hunting bodies about how to apply policy on hunting wild boars all the way across Europe, or are you having to deal with lots of different opinions?
Well, when it comes to hunting, there's a lot. The strength of hunting, and I use the term hunting, it's really shooting, but in a European context we use the term hunting. So the strength of hunting and shooting is really its diversity. We have a lot of diversity in Europe, and that's important. And there's a lot of diversity in hunting methods. I mean, you have a tradition here of releasing, quite big bags of game. You don't have that in many other countries. The Central European hunting culture is really based on, they have a certain language, hunting horns, clothing. Driven hunting is very important, driven wild boar. They have the tableau where they lay animals out afterwards. We have to engage because of African swine fever and wild boar, and we've made sure that the EU regulations, because all the member states have to follow them, haven't taken an overly strict approach. We had some crazy scenarios of recommendations of people shooting wild boar in helicopters, but we've brought that back down to those who hunt and shoot are really important partners in managing and eradicating African swine fever and wild boar. And it's really challenging because you have to bring your wild boar population down 80, sometimes 90%. And then you have a whole culture based on you don't shoot the sow, you don't shoot the female. You keep hunters are almost ingrained to keep a healthy population. So this is a real challenge. But we've made sure the EU regulations, when there is an outbreak, there's certain zones and there's certain activities that can and can't take place. But we've made sure that these are pro-hunting. There's a lot of discussion now on the use of sound moderators, on the use of night vision. There's a lot of fresh debates now in these countries where we've helped in those debates as well.
Now, one thing that's interested me about Europe and the way Europe has approached the whole question of hunting is there's been a trend towards making it a question of cultural heritage, and particularly sports like falconry have been enshrined as, almost untouchable because they're like the Acropolis in Athens, aren't they? Is that, can you claim credit for that, or is that just something which Europe was going to do anyway?
Oh, we can absolutely claim credit. There's a number of ways to defend hunting. You can be really proactive. There's conservation benefits, there's economic benefits, but the cultural benefits are really important. So falconry has international recognition under UNESCO. In Slovenia and the Czech Republic, they've also recognized hunting culture on their national UNESCO lists. You have about 15 countries now that have recognized falconry on their national UNESCO list. Just last week, Ireland recognized falconry as a tangible cultural heritage on the national list. So we see that as being really important. And there is another program of work we're having with our members on getting hunting culture recognized, because you've certain language, you've certain clothing, you've certain music, you've certain hunting horns that you cannot teach this, but it's been for really generations in existence. So it's an important argument to defend hunting.
Is anybody missing Europe yet? Anybody suddenly realised we've made a terrible mistake? No. Well, one person, Neil Parish MP, who is very Remain, he said, and he's very pro-hunting. He's a West Country MP, and he said that the problem is that the French farmers will never allow a ban on hunting across Europe. Hunting in Europe is absolutely guaranteed. Not so guaranteed in the UK now. Can you give us a kind of, from a hunting point of view, can you just give, and it's not going to make any difference, but can you give us the Remain arguments, please?
Yeah, I mean, the EU has no direct competence over hunting and shooting, and we want to keep it that way. A Remain argument, I would say the UK is going to be much more vulnerable outside of the EU. How to simplify this? When decisions are made under international agreements, there's an African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement that has banned the hunting of common potsherd, which is an important quarry species. Widgeon is declining at an alarming rate. You could have a ban on widgeon hunting. Under this agreement, the EU Birds Directive doesn't change. So the EU has to put in a reservation, and it can say, hang on, we don't accept this. So it keeps the legal basis to hunt there. The EU votes in bloc, so 28 member states vote together. A country cannot deviate when you're in the EU. So from a wildfowling perspective, the EU Birds Directive is a really good to protect shooting interests. When the UK is alone, it has to manage by itself as a party to these conventions. So depending on what government you have, we'll be certainly advising our members here, Face UK, with Basque Countryside Alliance, to give the correct arguments. But if you have a protection-focused government, they may not enter that reservation, and then you lose widgeon, could go off your hunting list. Common potsherd, most definitely. It's already in a hunting ban category. So these are the arguments where there's much more vulnerability. There's a lot of regulation. We have a new EU regulation coming on lead shot over wetlands. In fact, we expect a vote on that in September. My understanding is the UK has agreed to remain within the European Chemicals Agency and REACH. These are standards on chemicals, so you're still going to be implicated in that. Any future regulations on lead and ammunition, which there are likely to be, the UK is going to be implicated anyway if it remains a part of REACH. But because you export so much of your game meat, you're going to have to apply those same standards in any case. I mean, UK is a member of FACE for a long time, and now we have to really start some serious work. And we expect our work with the UK to continue in a much more intensive way over the next several years than it ever has done.
Is this about representing us with the Berne Convention particularly? Not so much with the EU, but there are still lots of aspects of what you might call Europe with a capital E that we're still very much wedded to. That's why we stay with FACE.
Absolutely. You have the Berne Convention, which is identical to the Birds Directive. You have Convention on Migratory Species that is doing a lot of work now on illegal killing of birds and lead and ammunition. You have the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement. You're still implicated in decisions around CITES and trade. But if you want to affect decision making, it has to be done at EU level. So that's why FACE exists, to do that work. As I said, these 80% of the rules are coming, and we're based in Brussels to try and make sure that these are pragmatic and not having negative impacts on shooting and hunting throughout Europe. So there's going to be more, believe it or believe it not, you have Brexit, but there's going to be more and more vulnerability and probably more talk of decision making within the EU and international institutions because of the vulnerability of the UK being outside of the EU, which is probably not what the voter expected.
Well, look, don't worry, everybody. Boris is in charge. I'm sure he'll sort it out.